Hi, everyone, and welcome to our third webinar session in the MAHA series. We'll just be a minute as other people continue to join, and then we'll get started briefly. All right, it looks like we're about 1 minute after the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to this third session of our MAHA webinar series, focusing on the MOCA assessment report and a bit of a deep dive on the implications. We'll start off just first with a few introductions. My name is Mike Gleason. I'm the product director for bakery for Parados USA. I'm joined today by Joe Layton. Joe is currently the leader of our R&D team for Parados US, which consists of over 50 food scientists, bakers, pastry chefs, and chocolatiers. He's a member of our US management team, as well as the global R&D steering committee. Joe joined Parados about 20 years ago as an entry-level R&D technologist, directly after graduating from Gettysburg with his degree in biology. He spent the early part of his career focused more on sweet goods R&D, where he learned to develop expertise both in formulation and industrial manufacturing for a wide variety of dessert products. Joe later expanded his roles and responsibilities, moving to the bakery R&D team, and at the same time completing his master's degree in food science from Kansas State University. In 2021, Joe took over the full responsibilities of the US R&D team as our vice president of R&D. And since taking on that role, he's focused on increasing collaborations with our customers, strengthening our supply chains, and improving raw materials and formulas while driving innovation. So welcome, Joe. Glad to have you here as well.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for the introduction.
Absolutely. Now with intros out of the way, we'll go ahead and take a look at the agenda for the day. So we're going to start with a bit of housekeeping details. We'll give an overview of Parados if you're not familiar with us yet already. We'll give some high-level overviews and takeaways from sessions 1 and 2. And then we'll dive into sessions 3's content, giving some background on MAHA and MOCA, what are some of the key areas of focus, and what we can expect moving forward. We'll save some time at the end to wrap up and answer any questions that we receive. We also have a short 2-minute survey at the end, so please stay on and scan that QR code and take the survey so we learn and can improve for our next webinar series. Now with that, some housekeeping details. I mentioned Q&A. Feel free to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. We will be sending this deck out afterwards, and we are recording this as well for you to view after the webinar as well. Again, as I mentioned, just 2-minute quick survey at the end to help us continuously improve with the content that we deliver. And now lastly, who is Parados? So Parados is an international company that offers a full range of innovative food ingredients and solutions for our 3 main product categories around bakery, sweet goods, and chocolates. We primarily service large industrial bakers and retailers in the US, but we also focus on food service chains, distributors, and artisan customers. Our local US headquarters is in Pennsauken, New Jersey, which is right across the bridge from Philadelphia, where we have our national production food footprint. And we have our global headquarters located in Belgium. And together, we like to say we move the planet forward by creating innovative food solutions for the health and well-being of people everywhere. Now, just a quick recap of session one. For those of you who weren't able to join, we had two guest speakers. We had Sophia from our Brados Group Regulatory Affairs. We also had Aaron Ball, who is the Executive Director for the Grains Food Foundation. We covered high level a little bit about what MAHA and the MOCA initiatives were and their potential impacts on the US food industry. But the main objective was to look at European food law and looking at food additives in Europe and how they might impact the legislation that moves forward in the United States. In the second session, we had Senna and Justine from our group regulatory and R&D teams, and they were discussing the topic of ultra-processed foods and how we see that conversation continuing to grow around what is ultra-processed food, and recognizing that there isn't a clear consensus or definition for what ultra-processed food is today. We do know that clean label is probably going to play a really important role in this solution to meet consumers' needs around more natural products and less of the ultra-processed foods. And we took a look at how consumers are kind of empowering themselves through food scanner apps like Yuka to be able to understand what's going on with their food and make a little bit more informed choices given the data that they can pull from those apps. Now, today we're going to be in our third session. We're going to be talking about the MOCA assessment report. So the report has been delivered to the president, but it has not yet been released to the general public. So for this webinar, we're going to take a little bit of a look at what we know already and what we can potentially expect coming out of this report once it is released to the general public. So for that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Joe to kick us off.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. So first, I figured I would start with a little bit of background on MAHA and MOCA. So MAHA, the Make America Healthy Commission, was established by executive order in February of this year. It's led by Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And really the mission is to investigate the root cause of childhood disease, chronic disease. So a subset of the MAHA movement is the MOCA movement, which is Make Our Children Healthy Again. And it's really focused on children's health. As Mike mentioned, the assessment was delivered in May, and we'll spend a bulk of the time going through what that assessment entailed and what some of those implications are. And then the strategy, as you mentioned, was delivered to the president, and we're expecting release of that in the coming days. So let's go ahead and dive in. So the first thing that the assessment really pointed out is some key statistics on chronic childhood disease. And the report's roughly 60 pages long, and there's a lot of information there. But some of the key statistics that came out were obesity in children is significantly up over the past. 1 in 5 children over the age of 6 are obese in the U.S. And you can see that red line compared to the other lines, which are a lot of other developed countries around the world. So we have significantly higher childhood obesity rates in the U.S. Autism is also increasing in terms of diagnosis. At this point, it's estimated by the CDC that 1 in 31 children are affected by autism in some degree. And also that 1 in 4 children now have or are pre-diabetic. A few other interesting statistics, childhood cancer rates have increased 40% since the 1970s. Teenage depression has nearly doubled over the last decade. And it's not just a matter of health, it's also, they're tying it to a matter of national security, because they're saying now that 75% of American youth are actually ineligible for military service, primarily due to health reasons. So that risks us not being able to defend our country at some point if the health crisis is not addressed. Now, the report also identifies 4 primary drivers that they believe are the things that are contributing to the poor health of children. The first one is poor diet. Many of the calories that children are consuming today are coming from what are being called ultra-processed foods. And what we learned during the last webinar is there's not necessarily a clear definition of ultra-processed, but generally it's accepted as products that contain chemical sounding ingredients and are high in macro ingredients like saturated fats, sodium, and sugars. So not giving necessarily the same nutritional benefits as whole foods, which generally are seen as being more nutritious. They also believe that corporations are influencing the dietary guidelines and that they haven't necessarily been as much dictated by science, which I think, again, some of these things are debatable, but they are what is presented in the report. Another thing is environmental chemicals. They're basically citing that children are vulnerable to chemical exposure, and that could potentially be contributing to the lack of poor health, and that there's a lack of regulatory oversight in controlling these chemicals. There are thousands of chemicals that are approved for use in the US, and it's not clear how well those have been screened according to the report. Another big one is lack of physical activity and chronic stress. As a child who grew up in the 80s, we spent a lot of time outside. Uh, I know with my children, we don't let them run around outside by themselves. They spend a lot of time in front of the screens, and I think that's happening in a lot of families across the US is that screen time has definitely increased, leading to a lack of physical activity in a lot of children. And then the last thing that they mention is over medicalization. So here, a couple of the drivers they're calling out specifically are a lack of individualized care, so not tailoring the needs, but more prescribing things that may not necessarily be needed. And there's also a lot of speculation around excessive medication and some questions around vaccines and their impact on health. So these are the main things that the report really is focusing on. In terms of where we see the biggest impact for the baking industry, I think the first one is really going to be food reform, and we're seeing a lot of noise around this, specifically around the synthetic dyes, the FD&C colors like red number 40, for example, but it includes the yellows, the blues, the greens. A lot of the communications around the fact that most countries around the world, or many countries around the world, don't allow those colors, but we still allow them in the US. And we touched on that during the first webinar around the regulatory approach differences between the US and Europe, for example. There's also some concerns around the GRAS system, specifically the self-GRAS process in the US, which essentially allows companies to declare a product as being self-GRAS with appropriate documentation that they keep on file, but not necessarily getting approval from any specific government body to be able to bring ingredients to market. And we also expect, realistically, the report is going to be pushing for the promotion of more whole food nutrition, getting more of the calories and macro ingredients from whole foods as opposed to foods that have been processed. The other area that could potentially affect the baking industry is around environmental safety. There's going to be a lot of research led by the National Health Institute of Health, rather, around chemical exposures and checking to see if we have the appropriate controls in place or what needs to be done more. And the EPA is recommending to regulate specific toxins. Where this could potentially come into play are the pesticides that are used today for growing the crops that go into many of our products. So far, the White House has commented that they're not going to be making recommendations around pesticides for the EPA, but there's also some speculation that the delay in the report is potentially related to some of the things commented on around pesticides. So it's going to be interesting to see how that report comes out, because if in fact they are going to be changing pesticides, there are comments from some of the growing associations saying that yields could decrease as much as 70%, which could lead to specific increases in prices and lack of supply, which would be a very challenging situation to be in as an industry. And even without the specific MAHA recommendations coming from the Health and Human Services Department, we are seeing a lot of laws being passed at the state level. West Virginia, for example, passed law HB 2354, banning the use of a lot of the artificial colors in school meals, effective already this school year, and in 2028 for all food sold in the state. Texas also passed a law in a similar way, saying that products developed after January 27th containing any of a list of roughly 44 ingredients, including artificial colors, but also ingredients like datum would be required to have a warning label. And the warning label is quite interesting and says this product contains an ingredient not recommended for human consumption by authorities in Australia, Canada, the EU, or the UK. So very, very interesting choice of wording here. And also, we touched on this as well during the webinar number one, but datum being one of those bread ingredients predominantly used in or listed is actually legally allowed in all four of these countries. So it also goes to show that some of the information that's being used is based on science, and others, there's a bit of misinformation. So we're hoping to see some more clarity on these things as the report's released. Also interesting, a lot of the states have signed bills preventing the SNAP funds from being used for candy and soda purchases. So historically, there were fewer restrictions on the way that those funds could be used by the families that were receiving them. And this really aligns with this MAHA approach of looking for ways that we can, through government controls, make sure that the food that people are consuming is healthier. So the map that's here on the right of the screen was from the Health and Human Services website, and it shows which states have already enacted laws that are aligned with the MAHA agenda. So there's at least 16 states that have already passed laws, and more than half of the states in the US also have bills proposed, which are going for voting at some point in the near future. So we do expect a lot of momentum around these changes at the state level, and hopeful that when the report comes, that we'll be able to actually standardize some of those so that we're not looking at a disjointed approach across the whole US. So another thing we touched on previously, and I think it's important to bring up, is that consumers are paying more and more attention to processed food and additives. I know in my family, I was raised with packaged snack cakes and things that probably contain ingredients that would be considered as banned in some of these legislations. And even now, my mom is asking me like, "Oh, how can you eat that? It has all these preservatives in it." And my mom doesn't even know what a preservative really is, but because everything that's a chemical is a preservative, whether it's an emulsifier. But that's the kind of attention that you're getting, and more of these conversations on social media, but also between people, are calling out these processed ingredients and these chemical-based ingredients, really, that they're nervous about. And I think that's the reality, is that even if the legislation is pushing for certain things, consumers are also pushing for it. And in the lack of legislation, there's still an opportunity for bakeries and people in the food industry to provide the types of solutions that customers are looking for, because the change is coming, and it's the opportunity to either be ahead of it or be behind potentially. So what can we expect from the report that was released on the 12th, and hopefully will go to the public here soon? We're expecting to see a comprehensive action plan with policy recommendations across many of the US departments between Health and Human Services, the FDA, USDA, EPA, National Health Institute. We're really expecting to see some national standards on food additives, I would say with a strong focus on the artificial colors. Expecting to see changes in the way that existing chemicals are reviewed and approved for use in the food industry. We're also expecting to see some AI-driven initiatives around surveillance of health and looking for trends so we can help identify those. A focus on education campaigns, making sure that we're allocating resources and funds to educating the public on things that affect their health and the best ways that they can stay healthy. And then also interventions around health and making sure that we're creating systems that, in theory, allow the country to become healthier. So some challenges ahead. I think the first challenge is, even without the formal legislation, consumer behaviors are changing. We are seeing people looking on the back of pack. They're being more choiceful in types of products that they're buying and the chemicals that may be inside of those, regardless of whether they're safe or not. There's a fear around things and an uncertainty, and sometimes uncertainty and fear drive people to make changes that aren't necessarily even rational. Another potential concern is cost increases. In a lot of cases, the artificial version of ingredients are cheaper than or less expensive than the natural versions. This is especially true in ingredients like flavors and colors, but it's not always the case. Some chemical emulsifiers, for example, like datum and SSL, can be replaced by ingredients like enzymes. And depending on the formulation, there can be a cost savings. So it is possible to both clean up the label and in some cases even reduce the cost of your product. One of the interesting dynamics that's happening in the US right now is around funding for government agencies and looking to reduce the scope and size of agencies, but at the same time, some of these initiatives are actually requiring more oversight and more regulation. So what we may see in the future is a lack of resources at the regulatory agencies to enforce or support some of these initiatives. And that might ultimately translate into a slowdown in ingredient innovation. Today, it's relatively easy to bring new ingredients to market. There's a certain process to follow, but you don't necessarily need that approval through that self-GRAS. In a future system, if we do need to have a positive approval for ingredients, it may slow the process down by 2 years or more compared to what we do today. And we see that's the way it works in Europe, for example, where we're often bringing ingredients to the market 1 to 2 years faster in the US because the regulatory hurdles are lower. So it's just a watch out that although the perception is there that these things are bad, it may also slow down a bit the innovation and what ingredient companies are capable of providing in terms of solutions moving forward. So I think I probably went through that relatively quickly, but a few points I wanted to wrap on is that the legislation is already changing at the state level. There's a lot of states that have these laws in place, so the change is coming for these ingredients and these formulations. But even without the legislation, consumer demand is probably going to outpace the legislation. Consumers are asking for these things now. They're asking for cleaner label solutions to remove artificial colors, and they're voting on those things with their wallets. And it's definitely a stress on the R&D and the quality and the production teams of our customers, but it's also an opportunity because this is where the areas of growth are going to be. And if you're not moving quickly enough, potentially someone else could come in and take that consumer if they're offering the level of clean label or the level of ingredient transparency that customer is looking for, that consumer is looking for. And I'd like to add that Paratus is here to help, and not just with ingredients, but we have a huge range of products that are what we call NAFNAC, no artificial colors, no artificial flavors. We also have cost reduction solutions between replacing chemical emulsifiers with enzymes. We can help with egg reduction, fat reduction, sugar reduction, things that not only translate potentially into healthier products, but also less expensive products, but with the same quality. And we have a huge team of technical expertise, bakers and application specialists that are happy to go into your facilities and work with you together hand in hand in our innovation centers to help develop some of these solutions and whatever reformulation needs you have, and basically to support your business moving forward. So that was it for me from a content perspective. I think at this point we'll hand it over to Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And I think you're spot on there. It's clear even if legislation moves slow, consumers move fast. So it's something to try to get ahead of. Absolutely. So we did have a few questions come in. So I'll kind of go through each here. First one is saying, considering the report was delayed, when do we think we can expect an official report shared out?
Yeah, at this point, I'd be speculating, but based on everything that we're reading, it sounds like within the next 1 to 2 weeks, we should be able to expect a report. We'll definitely keep an eye on it. I've been checking my Google alerts every day to see if the report's been released yet, and yeah, very interested to see what it actually contains when it's in its final form.
But I think it seems like it's not going to be months. Is basically the message. It should be within the next few days, weeks, even.
Yeah, and the way that so far the administration has been moving and things have been moving quickly, I would be surprised if it's months versus weeks.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So another question here. Do we expect the state laws, like the ones you mentioned around West Virginia and Texas, to be more strict than the MAHA legislation?
There are probably going to be some differences between the MAHA legislation and the state laws. We've seen that California, for example, a few years ago went first on some of these ingredient bans, but I think we are hoping that there will be an alignment for the new bills moving forward and that some of the core of it can be the same because otherwise it just makes it very challenging for everyone on this call to manage all the complexity at the state level. But that's the hope is that we can get to a system that is standardized across the US that also meets the expectations of the individuals in the states and the consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it could get pretty disjointed if we have every state with their own food labels. We did receive another question in here. What are the ingredients that are most under pressure? Are the dyes because of child hyperactivity, or is it something else?
I would say that dyes are the number one thing that's under the most pressure, and exactly that, the hyperactivity in children. And I think also when you look at the fact that Europe has had those dyes banned for a long time, that adds some fuel to the fire that those ingredients should be targeted and removed relatively quickly.
Mhm. Yeah. I think the Texas warning statement is kind of a great sign of that, like calling out specifically the countries that have already banned it. We have another question here. Do you think the US will move towards a standard scoring system eventually, like the Nutri-Score, or do you think it will stop at warning labels or for specific ingredients?
I think we're going to move towards a standard system. The FDA has been asking for comments around UPFs. Um, Front of pack labeling has been a topic for the FDA for quite a while now. We see front of pack labeling schemes across many countries. One of the things I've joked in the past is the only thing I can say for certain is that our front of pack scheme won't be the same as any other country around the world because we always seem to do our own thing. As nice as it would be to harmonize that across the some of the different countries, I'm not
Mhm.
expecting to see the same scheme in the U.S. as any other countries, but I would expect that to come in the next few years. But again, I think if you look at some of the pressures on the resources at the FDA, it's a question of how soon will they be able to make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question here just came in. What is the biggest challenge for R&D teams when reformulating products to remove artificial colors?
The biggest problem is probably shelf life. A lot of the artificial colors tend to fade over time, or I mean, sorry, the natural colors tend to fade over time, where the artificial colors tend to stay more vibrant. So in
Mm,
some cases, it's a matter of identifying specific blends or also looking at the processing conditions. Natural colors tend to be a little bit more susceptible to changes during processing and can sometimes brown depending on the temperature the pH is used. So but for sure, shelf life is one of the biggest challenges because it's also one of these things that takes time. You don't necessarily know how well that color is going to hold up until the end of shelf life, which really increases the length of your development time when you're doing these types of tests.
mm, okay. And then we had two more questions here. One is you mentioned cost saving solutions. How can we find out more information about cost savings?
Hopefully, you have a Parado sales rep who can organize a discussion with you. If you don't have a Parado sales rep, my email address will be at the end of the presentation. You can reach out to me. I can make sure you get pointed in the right direction. And we'd be happy to set up a conversation, understand the types of products that you're making today and what potential solutions we may have to offer you in terms of savings.
Just to add a shameless plug as well, we are going to be at IBIE in September. So we're at booth 4131. I will be there as well at our cost saving station. So if you want to figure out more about how we can help you out with that, come see us at IBIE. And then the last question we had here is, given the uncertainty around the direction of MAHA, uh, does it make sense to wait to change any formulas?
I think it's a great question. I would say if we look across everything that's happening right now, products with artificial colors for sure should be high on the agenda to remove. Even without the legislation, I think, like I mentioned before, the consumers are going to be looking for products without those colors sooner rather than later. A lot of the current laws are going into effect 2027, 2028, so there is time. But my recommendation would be to look at the recipes, do a risk assessment, and see beyond the artificial colors, are there any other ingredients that may also need to be changed at the same time? And try and decide if you can touch all of those now or if you want to wait on those. But the colors, I probably wouldn't wait on because we know that that's coming and that's what consumers are looking for. And it frankly creates an opportunity for a competitor to come in with an offering that may already be cleaner and the possibility of losing some share if you're not acting quickly enough.
And to your point, it takes time to validate those as well, right? The evolution of those colors, depending on your product, could be something that you need to run several iterations of. So
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Great. Well, I think that is the end of the questions. I'll keep my eye out, see if any more come in. Otherwise, just to wrap up, if you have specific questions, Joe, I think your contact info is on the next slide there.
Forgot I was driving.
No worries. I'm also going to drop a link in the chat to everybody. This is a link to the survey that you'll see a QR code for on the next slide. And again, it's just a quick 2-minute survey while we still have you here. Take the time to give us a little bit more feedback on how we can be doing better. Otherwise, thank you for participating in our webinar series. And until next time, we will continue to be your partner for food innovations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.